Avatar: The Last Airbender was always going to be a tough act to follow. It's the most critically revered of all the Nicktoons, bar none. Michael Dante DiMartino, Brian Konietzko, and their team had proven themselves to be amazing storytellers, but they couldn't let it end so soon. They say to always leave your audience wanting more, and that's just what they did. The Avatar franchise has continued with comics and live-action retellings, but the animated sequel series ended up being the most polarizing continuation overall, The Legend of Korra. Not all loved, not all hated. The Legend of Korra ignites a lot of passion in the Avatar fandom. Weird to think because it's still an impressive show on a lot of fronts. The stories are still ambitious, the animation's top of its class, and the characters are going to stick with you. But even in casual conversation, I heard from friends that it's just okay, just because it's not as good as Avatar: The Last Airbender. While not my kind of show, I was very enamored with it when I reviewed it 2 years ago, so I still had healthy expectations for Korra. And some of them were met after you get a massive spoiler warning and endure a little history lecture first. Avatar: The Last Airbender concluded on July 19th, 2008, and vanished from the main Nickelodeon feed soon after. It was a story that had been planned out before production had commenced, and now it was over. But this is the television industry, and here, we never leave good enough alone. M. Night Shyamalan was already busy directing a hilariously unfaithful film adaptation of the show's first season. Meanwhile, Bryke were developing a sequel series set far in the future, following the Avatar succeeding Aang. Announced at Comic-Con 2010 as a 12-episode miniseries, it exceeded expectations when it was previewed online early on March 24th, 2012, before it premiered on Nick on April 14th, 2012. So a 14-episode renewal was granted, then a 26-episode renewal after that, and they had to produce it quickly. In contrast to Avatar: The Last Airbender, where they had the story outline planned before production, now they were working on 3 books at once. Their animation services had to be split between 2 studios, and things got so speedy that they were writing book 4 while book 2 was being finished. And sure, they had 4 seasons, one more than The Last Airbender, but they had 9 less episodes to produce. Unfortunately, the hassle didn't seem to be turning out bigger results, as a little over midway through book 3, Nickelodeon stopped airing new episodes on their main feed. And they weren't just going to give it the Nicktoons treatment of dumping it on their second channel, oh no! Instead, they were going to post new episodes on their website, nick.com, with little promotion. This would be a very convenient, ahead of its time tactic if nick.com hadn't become a broken shell of its former self by 2014. Even more so today, where it's a barely functional dumping ground of hot links. This treatment stung, but there were reasons to rejoice for the finale when it was uploaded on December 19th, 2014. If you didn't like the show, because it was over. If you did like it, because it happened.
What makes you so sure your daughter is the one?
Korra, please come in here.
I'm the Avatar! You gotta deal with it!
Aang is dead. That's the story of The Legend of Korra. Generations have passed since the Avatar returned, and Aang grew old and passed away. But the Avatar lives on, its new incarnation being a waterbender by the name of Korra. She continues to struggle with airbending as a teenager though, so eventually sneaks away to Republic City, where she hopes to get some training from Aang's son, Tenzin. There, she also gets a good rapport with some local pro-benders, Mako and Bo Lin, a bad rapport with the Chief of Police, Toph's daughter Lin, and a new threat to benders in a shady underground movement. Then another evil guy, then another evil guy, then an evil girl. It's very different from the first series, but why not? It's been a few generations, the world has changed, and the ways threats to its balance present themselves have to change as well. The whole structure of the show's story is different to The Last Airbender because of how much happens. Team Avatar only had one goal before, to restore balance. The goalposts shifted a few times, but there was always a singular event the characters were preparing for. The Legend of Korra has 4 different stories, one for each book. We've gone from the Lord of the Rings approach to the, Sherlock Holmes approach. And that drastically changes how character development is approached now. Korra is as different from Aang as you can imagine. She's feisty, impatient, and more vulnerable, and can let bad situations get to her. I was prepared with the knowledge that Korra was a departure from Aang, and you better be too. Her feistiness doesn't always work for me, her threatening people is always quite off-putting, but I still think her character is solid overall, and given plenty of room to grow. I'm fine with the idea that the Avatar can be vastly different in personality between incarnations. As for the other members of Team Avatar, the soccer replacement was split into two brothers, Mako and Bolin. Mako the Firebender feels like the stern leader type that Sokka tried to be in the first 3 episodes, while Bolin the Earthbender is like the more chipper and comedic character he eventually became. They were separated from their families at a young age, so had to become bending athletes to scrape by. I've immediately got sympathy for both of them, and I'm eager to follow where their lives go. With their different personalities, they were bound to go in pretty different directions. But what's Avatar without a little love for animals? The new Appa is Naga, Korra's giant pet polar bear dog, who may not have a big, heartbreaking solo adventure, but is still useful and cute, and that's all you really need. Bolin has the new Momo, Pabu the fire ferret. He's mostly just around for the occasional circus trick, but I can see why this show about older teens and tougher struggles may not have had much time to spare on a circus ferret. Tenzin was Aang's oldest child, so is supposedly the ideal mentor for Korra. While they have their rough patches due to Tenzin being very stern, they mostly get along, but it's clear that he can be easily swayed to any idea, making him seem pretty fickle. I wouldn't say that makes him a worse character at all, just one you can't always predict the choices of. He starts out with 3 children, Jinora, Iki, and Milo, with Rohan following soon after. Of these, Jinora is the only one who ever becomes plot relevant, but they try with Iki and Milo and succeed halfway. They start off as loud little kids, but Jinora slowly starts to act more like Aang, so it feels like she's growing up. Lin is Toph's oldest daughter and the chief of police in Republic City. Even sterner and lesser nonsense than Tenzin, she is obscenely grizzled, and that's what makes her so interesting. Toph also started out rather distant and standoffish, so it's like they're reintroducing that complication with more hurdles and emotional baggage. Lastly, for the main characters, there's Asami, daughter of a wealthy businessman turned cultist. She has to take on the mantle of his company, Future Industries, restore its reputation, and she becomes a more frequent ally to Team Avatar over time, eventually becoming Korra's best friend. But she's more than a friend, she's a tragic character who you want to see do the right things and prove how different she is from her father. Those are all the main characters besides the antagonists, who I'll save for their individual seasons, but some of my favourite side characters include Iska and Desna, the children of the current chief of the Water Tribe. They're monotone goths, but have enough of an unnerving impact on those around them to leave an impact on you. There's also Varric, an eccentric businessman who stays peppy no matter how much hot water he gets himself into. He's a ray of sunshine during the muddier periods of this show, and his assistant Zhu Li eventually gets things to do, I promise. I also really like the narrator, Shiro Shinobi, this old-timey newscaster who gets you up to speed in an entertaining way. The recaps are something I personally think Korra does better than The Last Airbender, simply due to how thrillingly they're presented, compared to the standard clip montage that every serialized show does. It's a sequel series, so they have to give the audiences something new and different, and maybe more mature.
We got your back, Korra, and we can save the city together.
Yeah, let's do it.
Took them a long break, but they finally got one book out of each of the elements. This one being about air because it's the element Korra is learning to master throughout the season, both in honing airbending techniques and befriending Tenzin, which can both happen with patience. Korra doesn't have much patience. She's sneaking out to watch some pro bending, then partaking in the sport herself, and this is where she meets Mako and Bolin, and a love triangle quickly forms when Asami enters the picture. Not to call this a cliche storm, but it's like they picked teenage TV plotlines out of a hat and made a season of Avatar out of them. I find the characters interesting enough to carry these familiar stories, and I was starting to enjoy the vibe of Republic City. The Last Airbender and the later books of Korra hop around from place to place, but this steampunk abode was awesome to sink into and explore. And I'm not gonna be one of those fans who's annoyed that they jumped a millennium forward of our technology in a little under a century. People can turn into the moon and only now you're questioning the realism. Bending had to have made a lot of these advancements easier, and Republic City is eye candy. But we can't talk about nice things yet, because here's the villain of Book 1 and their diabolical plan. Amon claims to be a non-bender and is leading a revolution of equalists, flaunting that he has the power to take away anyone's bending abilities. Compared to the public and bombastic threat Ozai was, Amon makes for a challenging follow-up. They had to make his growing presence natural, his rhetoric convincing, and his intentions mysterious. And they did all of this with flying colors. He's my favorite villain in this series, and on top of that, this is my favorite season. It tells the most complete story in the shortest time, and really benefited from having more time to plan. It isn't perfect, the middle portion with the love triangle and pro-bending filler slows the pace down a little bit, but then Amon crashes back into the spotlight with a vengeance, so they were aware of what was most important, maintaining balance and giving Korra troubles to overcome. And this is the part where I bring up that the animation is great, show you some clips and all that, but I wanted to explain why I think this show came out looking so gorgeous. This is the first Nicktoon I'm reviewing to have been produced in high definition from the beginning. While I watched The Last Airbender after it had been upscaled, Korra, you can tell, has a much deeper and richer look. The character animation, effects animation, fight choreography, that's all still impressive, but I was keen on their willingness to incorporate CGI for certain props and sets. I know how it's animated, but I'm not taken out of the experience. Most of the show was animated by Studio Mir, a pretty new South Korean studio at the time, founded by former Avatar animator Jae Yu. The easiest name there is to butcher, my apologies if he ever watches this. But due to the tight schedule, a couple episodes in Book 2 had to be taken to the Japanese studio Puro. They've done plenty of anime, including Naruto, and their episodes are fine overall, but Studio Mir was practically made for this franchise.
Jinora, be careful! Hold on!
Hey! Watch where you're going, you giant clod!
Sorry.
6 months have passed in universe, and 15 for the audience, and things seem to be going fine for Korra and Mako. Not so much for Bolin and Asami, but during the winter solstice at the Southern Water Tribe, Korra gets impressed by her uncle Unalaq's ability to waterbend a dark spirit, and jumps at the chance to be an apprentice to him instead of Tenzin. But it quickly becomes apparent that Unalaq just wants to use her to initiate his evil plans. Quickly for us, really slowly for the characters. That plan is to unlock the spirit world and team up with a dark old spirit called Vatu, but by the time this all goes down, nearly everyone's made a big mistake, which dampens their heroic nature. Korra ditching Tenzin, especially after he did everything he could to help her last book, was a shock, but I think she deals with enough consequences throughout the story. Mako joins Lin's police force, but lets his guard down and gets framed for Unalaq's crimes a few times. That and he goes through a rough breakup with Korra, who then gets amnesia and later somehow remembers everything but the breakup, so they must have known there was no point committing to the angst of this plot point. And Bolin's become a mover star with Varric's direction, blissfully ignorant that their movers are promoting anti-Northern sentiment. On one hand, it's funny to see him as a celebrity, but on the other, you just know this is going to lead to something bad. So tons of goofy decisions in the first half of the season, but they all learn their mistakes by the end, and this is all part of growing up. There's an overarching theme in this series now of getting older and experiencing more suffering and sorrow. Even if I wasn't so forgiving towards the main plots and less memorable villain, the side characters hold the season up. I like Tenzin's little journeys with his siblings, Kaya and Bumi. Jinora starts to come into her own. We see Iroh again in the spirit world, which was a massive surprise to me, and I loved the flashback to the very first Avatar, 1, but I'll delve more into that later. Why yes, it is on the best episodes list. Book 2 gets a lot of flack from fans and critics, but I'm at least happy that developing the supporting cast took high priority, although actually led to better payoffs than for the main cast this time.
You're an airbender now, and you have a responsibility as a citizen of the world.
Whatever. I didn't ask to become an airbender, you know?
The bad news is, Korra's lost her connection to all the previous avatars. The good news is, spirits and humans are now free to coexist, and new airbenders are starting to get reported all over the world. So Team Avatar travel around to find new recruits for the Air Nation, but aren't able to find many aside from this young thief by the name of Kai. Meanwhile, an old enemy, Zahir, gets out of prison and reforms a gang of anarchists called the Red Lotus. Then Team Avatar goes to Ba Sing Se and finds that, while not as dystopian as last time we saw it, the Queen's still not very nice, holding any new airbender she sees hostage. And as if this season isn't already busy enough, they then go to Zhao Fu to meet Lin's estranged sister, Su Yin, and a slow healing process in their relationship begins. But Team Avatar still finds trouble within the Metal City as a certain someone seems to be working with Zahir, maybe the living lie detector guy. There's a lot more of importance happening here than in the last two books, because Korra's been kicked out of Republic City, so she has to spend the foreseeable future traveling. Mako and Bolin meet up with their remaining family in Ba Sing Se, so we get more touching moments between them. It's the sort of emotional plotline I was waiting for with them, after the last season was content to throw them romantic conflicts and new jobs. It was thrilling to see the Air Kingdom slowly get rebuilt, relieving to learn more about why Lin is such a hard-ass and see her work to mend her relationship with Su Yin, cool to see Zuko return, and cathartic yet freaky to see the Queen's empire fall. Seeing a whole city fall into anarchy is, in my opinion, the darkest thing this franchise has done, and shows the awesome power the Red Lotus can wield through their rhetoric. Zahir was a great bounce back for the villain roster. What really elevates him is Henry Rollins' performance. His thoughts are usually delivered in a calm and collected way, sounding a lot like Aang did in his more contemplative moments. He truly believes what he says and does will make the world a better place, despite how destructive it can be. The other members of the Red Lotus aren't as memorable, but they're there for variety and to prove that at least one member from every nation agrees with what he's saying, making them more powerful together. You could argue that, especially with the last two episodes, the series was getting too dark and adult and losing some of the fun and hope that still permeated through the darkest moments of The Last Airbender, but I'm happy that the franchise hasn't lost its commitment to wisdom. Book 3 has some rough patches, but it is a big enough improvement over 2 to make me excited to see how it would all end.
That ought to do it. Huh. Okay, stand back. There we go!
3 years have passed, no mistaking the main 4 characters are all in their 20s now, and the season premiere is one of the driest episodes of any Nicktoon I've ever seen. You require an attention span to know what's going on for the rest of the season. Mako's become the bodyguard for Prince Wu, who's about to be crowned king. Bolin's working under Kuvira, an Earth Kingdom leader with her own plans to start an empire, whether everyone around her wants to help or not. Asami's briefly given something major to do, talk with her imprisoned father. She may not have been as big a player in events as Mako or Bolin, but I like that they threw her this heart-wrenching story while they could. As for Korra, she's been poisoned by the Red Lotus and mentally traumatized by all the stuff she's been through, so runs off and becomes a nomad while no one's paying attention. She earned some time off to think, as it seemed like every villain she's encountered has scarred her more than the last. But with a little help from Toph, who herself is living in peace and seclusion, she helps get the last of the poison bent out of her and regains the confidence to save the world. Toph's return was worth the wait and the surprise, because they were so vague about her whereabouts, and if she was still alive, and because we'd learnt so much about her daughters and how she's left the Earth Kingdom. But my favourite new character in Book 4 would have to be Kuvira. Her intentions were just, but the ways she accomplished them were sneaky, violent, and self-serving. She's someone with way too much power and knows exactly what to do with it. I wasn't so keen on the new Earth Prince, Wu. It gets a bit tiresome seeing someone who's got a lot of responsibility act so childish and make so many pee jokes, but I understand they wanted to pair Mako up with someone new like this, since Bolin's too old now. Book 4 has some low points like the boring premiere and the clip show, but with the latter, most clip shows are never that good. It also has some high points for this series, with the more technology-focused action resulting in some startling animation. I also like how we've jumped forward a few decades with Republic City's visual style, now looking more like a 1940s metropolis. You click the video, you're going to hear me gush over backgrounds, that was the agreement. And how about that climactic battle? I love how every season pays tribute to a different style of Japanese media action with these. Books 1 and 3 were shonen-esque, Book 2 is a kaiju battle, and Book 4 leans into mecha, everyone can be satisfied. And it all ends with a wedding between Varric and Zhu Li, followed by some heavy implications that Korra and Asami are in love too. It's been speculated that this LGBTQ+ reference was another reason Nickelodeon stopped airing the show on their main feed, maybe out of censorship, maybe out of fear they'd get backlash from conservatives. Same thing happened with Static Cling a couple years later. While I'm not an expert on the subject, I hope I've made it clear across my channel's history that I just want everyone under the rainbow to be happy and safe and loved. So if The Legend of Korra helped you discover yourself in some way, then don't let anyone take that away from you. Just like I'm not gonna let anyone take away these top 9 episodes for me. Reunion was a mood lifter in the dire middle of Book 4. Korra and Asami reuniting was heartwarming, like they were already letting on that they were more than good friends, and Varric and Bolin's misadventure gives us some action and a chance for Bolin to be the mature one for once. A breath of fresh air is the peak of Book 3 for me, not to say it was all a downhill slope. This was the best premiere at making the oncoming stories seem fresh and thrilling, so I was captivated right away, and viewers at the time had to be due to the 7-month break between seasons. The aftermath is the classic Asami episode. She has great moments after this for sure, but her discovering who her father truly is and taking the company in a better direction was proof that she wants what's best for the world and is a valid member of Team Avatar. And the winner is Amon in a twisted way. I was getting a little concerned that pro bending had taken up so much time in the season so far, but I needn't have worried, because the protagonists got a stern reminder that evil was afoot and a gripping battle to let it sink in. A Leaf in the Wind was a great introduction to Mako and Bolin, and also a good showing of how Korra will learn all her lessons. Morally, through getting to know the world, and in training, by getting in on the action. A new spiritual age was made to be nostalgic, and while I only watched through The Last Airbender a few years ago, it works for me. Iroh was a nice surprise, he gets to help Korra out in a meaningful way, and we see what the big library is like these days. More or less the same. The revelation was when I was convinced this show could be amazing. It fantastically conveys a lot of things. The darker places this show could go, the threat level of Amon, and the greater stress put on Korra throughout her following adventures. It added intensity to her legend, and I am thankful for that. Korra alone is similar in that it focuses on the intensity and severity of how these adventures have affected Korra, and made me feel appropriately sorry for her. Even when she tries to strike out on her own as a drifter, she can't get her spirit back, so the cliffhanger where they reveal Toph was a light at the end of the tunnel. My favourite Legend of Korra story is a two-parter, Beginnings. It takes a deep dive into the mythos of the Avatar world, all the way back to how the very first Avatar, 1, got his powers. But it isn't just that, it's got a gorgeous historical aesthetic, understandable setup for why the human and spirit worlds are so distant, and ties into the story in the present without being reliant on your knowledge of it. You can watch these episodes entirely on their own and still be satisfied with what this show has to offer. A good feeling when there are some pretty bad episodes once in a while. After all these years is a really boring premiere. It sets up a lot of important plot beats, sure, but it's so dry and muted that it barely feels like an episode of a Nicktoon. I better appreciate the tonal balance they'd nailed before, but this felt out of balance. Good start to a book called Balance. Peacekeepers was a painful one, seeing them try and fail to juggle the political drama and romance between Korra and Mako, and both stories are left off worse than they started. Bolin gullibly joining Varric's propaganda officially became the best Team Avatar plot of the season here. Remembrances is the clip show, and I can only compare it to the Ember Island players. They both served to recap a majority of the show in a silly way, but Remembrances was pretty annoying in its execution, and spent its sweet time recapping one of my least favorite subplots. Into the Void was not what I was expecting from this show, and that's a bad thing. They dedicated an entire episode to the "I thought we had a deal" cliche. I'm not on board with the protagonists trusting the Red Lotus in any capacity, especially after they caused Ba Sing Se to fall into chaos. And worst of all was the sting, which just made Mako look like a desperate ass for seeking help from very suspicious looking triads. I don't feel bad that he got framed through all this, because I barely liked him anyway by this point in the season. But I don't want the negatives to be the main takeaway, because I still think The Legend of Korra is a great show, better than just good. Just because it isn't as consistent as The Last Airbender, the show, not the movie, doesn't mean it's that flawed. That's a high standard to live up to, and I'm really happy when it does. I think some aspects are overhated, but I get why any diversion from The Last Airbender was going to sit wrong with avid fans. What'll stick with me isn't Korra's needless aggression, the generic love conflicts, or the villains attaining power way too easily. It's going to be the stuff that worked, the added lore, the colourful cast, the daringness to go to more mature places with a pretty high success rate. For the future of the Avatar series and animation, I hope they don't just repeat what worked about The Last Airbender. I hope they continue to surprise us and give us rich characters and cultures to find ourselves in. That's what I liked about The Legend of Korra, and it's what I'm looking forward to whenever the next Avatar Studios production is announced, to be taken in all over again.
I've been dying to ask you, what happened to Zuko's mom?
Well, Denora, it's an incredible tale.